What's going on, guys? It's Jimmy here. We're looking at significant risk of a U.S. default here very, very soon, which could mean a financial collapse of our financial or significant collapse of our financial system here in the United States, the stock market, the bond market, payments to Social Security recipients, the Medicare system, the Medicaid system, SSI, SSDI. Anybody who works for the government, any type of cash coming from the government could be in significant peril here. Take a look here. The Congressional Budget Office says, quote, significant risk the U.S. defaults on its debt in the first 2 weeks of June. Less than a month away here. Saying, well, I get to that here also. Also, Republican senators disavowed Trump on the debt ceiling, growing rift. As Republican senators saying we shouldn't default. We'll get to both this here. The Congressional Budget Office issued a report Friday updating its projected timeline for when the nation risks defaulting on its debt, estimating the federal government deadline could now be the quote the first 2 weeks of June, not knowing the exact day or when this would happen. The nonpartisan budget scorekeeper warned Friday morning that there is a greater risk the Treasury Department is on track to exhausting the extraordinary measures that they're already taking and has been doing so since January to temporarily stave off a federal default if Congress fails to raise or suspend the default ceiling in time. Quote, the extent to which the Treasury will be able to fund the government's ongoing operations will remain uncertain throughout May. Even if the Treasury ultimately runs out of funds in early June, the report said. They chalked up the uncertainty largely to timing and the amount of revenue collections and outlays over the intervening weeks could differ from the CBO's projections. The CBO previously estimated in February that the federal government would default between July and September and is now earlier. So we're now going to default potentially earlier. Of course, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said it could be as early as June 1st. Yeah. So this report is the latest warning that Congress faces a more serious time crunch to raise the debt ceiling than previously expected. Tax receipts came in lower than expected last month, which has sapped money from the federal government, which they could have used to stave off a default. Treasury Department warned last week that the U.S. could default as soon as June 1st. Quote, if Congress fails to do that, it really impairs our credit rating. We have to default on some obligation, whether it's treasuries or payments to Social Security recipients. Treasury Department Secretary Janet Yellen warned in an interview on Bloomberg Television on Friday. That's something America hasn't done since 1789, and we shouldn't start now. Their meeting with Kevin McCarthy and President Biden was delayed, the second meeting, and their aides have been going through some of the negotiation details, trying to iron out some of that stuff. They do expect to have a second meeting here soon, but honestly, they're not there. They're not there in terms of negotiation and getting a deal done. They're not, honestly, they're not really close here. Senate Republicans are disavowing former President Donald Trump's call to let the federal government default on its debt unless President Biden agrees to massive spending cuts, which would be cuts to SNAP benefits, Medicaid benefits, cuts across the board, really. Dismissing Trump's suggestion as something far too risky to seriously consider. If you've seen that previous video, the interviewer said, but former President Donald Trump, you said that the debt ceiling should not be a tool to be negotiated with. And he said, oh, but I said that when I was president. So, yeah, when I'm president, you shouldn't do it. But I'm not president now, so now they should let the country default. Which is crazy, right? The cold reception to Trump's bold statement is the latest sign of widening rift between Trump and his Republican Party in Washington. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska said, I don't think anybody suggesting that we have to do a default is a wise policy or wise strategy for this country, adding that Trump certainly doesn't impact her view. She argued it would be far more productive to encourage Biden and McCarthy to work together to reach a compromise rather than pushing a default as a viable option. Quote, right now the talks are going on with the top four and of course the White House and now the staffs. What we want to do is encourage that every step of the way. Senate Republican Whip John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, said, I almost said San Diego there for a second, said most people recognize we need to strike a deal here, which is what they need to do, and predicted that Trump's impacts won't get much traction among Republican lawmakers. I don't think we want to go there with the potential consequences, he said, of a potential default. When Senator John Cornyn from Texas, when asked about that, says nobody thinks default is a good idea. Nobody. Trump wouldn't have wanted a default when he was president. It's an absolutely terrible, terrible thing for our country. McCarthy on Thursday distanced himself from Trump's comments, saying, quote, the only thing I see right now is that the Republicans make sure default is not on the table. We've raised the debt limit. When he says this, it's a little confusing because people think that the debt limit is raised. It's not raised. Republicans passed last month to raise the debt ceiling only in the House, so it's not passed. They passed the bill in the House, but it hasn't passed in the Senate. It won't pass. Their bill won't pass in the Senate. They have to come to a compromise here. Senator Mitt Romney, Republican from Utah, said, well, yeah, we can't do a default, but we should find a way to compromise. That's what you expect a president to do. Romney said Trump is rooting for a default because it's in his political interests. And honestly, that's pretty much the truth. It would make Biden look bad, and it would make Trump look good. If there were a default, the one person who might be tempted to celebrate politically would be Donald Trump, because he'd say, if I were president, this never would have happened. Romney also criticized Trump for saying he would pardon the people who invaded the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and for not expressing support for Ukraine in its war against Russia, saying, quote, a crime is a crime. I believe in juries, and people who have been convicted of a crime ought to pay the penalty that the jury or the court imposed and that they agreed to in some cases. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy said he wasn't that surprised that Trump advised Republicans to let the nation default. It doesn't surprise me that he'd say that. He's a candidate trying to run on a very populist base, and I think he feels that that will position him in a place to get more votes. I think he'll say whatever he needs to get more votes. Now, those are all what Republican senators are saying. It's literally all the voices from Republican senators. So you guys can let me know your thoughts on this. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen plans to huddle with Wall Street bankers as default looms, saying that she's in talks with bankers to discuss the impasse over raising the government's borrowing limit and preparing them in case there is a default, and bracing for the worst. Yeah. Janet Yellen sends a default warning if Congress fails, saying we've never been this close because Congress is so far away from actually making a deal. And President Biden faces legal risks and financial peril if he tries to raise the debt ceiling with the 14th Amendment and tries to raise the debt ceiling by himself. If Congress fails to raise the debt ceiling, if Republicans and Democrats fail to come to a compromise and the president tries to raise it on his own. The unprecedented step of President Biden invoking the 14th Amendment to avoid a national default would likely lead to legal uncertainty hanging over the already fragile financial system. Markets are concerned about a default, which could come as early as June 1st, and Biden and lawmakers can't come to an agreement. But if Biden chose to do it himself unilaterally, which is almost like an executive order, the financial system could take a massive hit with the risk of default being tied up in courts, which would probably almost certainly happen, like we've seen happen with the student loan forgiveness being tied up in courts. The president said there have been discussions about whether or not the 14th Amendment can be invoked to avoid a default, saying, I don't think that solves our problem now. I think that only solves your problem if once the court has ruled that it does apply for future endeavors. If he does do it, Biden could be sued by Treasury bondholders awaiting debt payments. From U.S. Republican lawmakers could also sue Biden, arguing he violated Congress's control over federal spending and taxation by ignoring the debt limit. But it's honestly, this whole debt limit thing, it's just such a broken way of doing things. We can't keep doing this every single year. And honestly, the perfect thing that kind of sums this up is when Trump said that when he was president, that this shouldn't be a tool to be negotiated over. I don't remember the exact quote that he said. It's in the CNN town hall, but Trump said that you shouldn't negotiate over the debt ceiling um, when he was president. But now that he's not president, he says that they should default, which is actually kind of sad to say that you should let that happen to our country. And think about it, 8 million jobs would be lost, Social Security payments would be delayed, people that work for the government would not get their paychecks, the stock market would collapse, the bond market would collapse, or the US dollar would collapse. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear my wife, but as the president, you should have the country's best interest. You should have the people's best interest. Um, and that's be the absolute worst thing that can happen for our country, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, left, right, or center. Um, that's like the worst thing that can happen. And when I read all those Republican statements, those Republican senator statements, one after one after one after one, they're all like, no default. Default's the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen. And I don't remember who said it, but somebody pointed out that said the reason Trump wants that to happen is because it would make Biden look bad and it would be good for him. But it literally would be bad for everybody else, the whole country, like everybody. So the only person that would be good would be for Trump himself, and every other person in the United States it would be bad for. It would raise interest rates, it'd raise mortgage rates, it would plummet our dollar. It would just be absolutely terrible. And the only person that'd be good for is Trump because he could say, "Oh, well, look what Biden did." Meanwhile, we would all suffer. So yeah, we don't want this to happen. It wouldn't be good just to say, oh, well, look what this guy did. But really, it's not Biden who did it. It's Congress has to come up with the agreement. It's just like the Republicans and Democrats Congress has to do it, the House and the Senate. Biden's the guy who gets to sign it at the end. It's the House and Senate that has to come to the agreement. So let me know your thoughts here in the comments. I'll keep you up to date here. I know you can't make this stuff up, but let me know your thoughts here in the comments. If you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any new videos here. And yeah, we'll see what happens here. You can click here to watch my newest video next. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next video.